I've been playing video games my whole life, but somehow I've never touched a single Final Fantasy game until now. While I'm not a huge fan of JRPGs, I do have some level of experience with other games from that tradition. Over the years, I've really enjoyed a couple of non-standard JRPGs, like the Mega Man Battle Network series, for example. And one of my favorite games of all time, Super Mario RPG, was even developed by Square and came out the year before their seminal game, Final Fantasy VII. Right or wrong, that's the game in the series that's gotten the most attention over the years. So I decided that my first encounter with this storied franchise should be Final Fantasy VII Remake. I am obviously not qualified to talk about the Final Fantasy series in general, or the JRPG genre at large. What I can do is offer the perspective of a newcomer. For those even more unfamiliar with Final Fantasy than me, it's a long-running anthology series of RPGs. Final Fantasy VII isn't a sequel to Final Fantasy VI, it's an entirely different continuity, world, set of characters, and systems. There are some common elements shared between games, but each numbered game resets the board. If a Final Fantasy game wants to make a direct sequel or prequel, then they either have to have a subtitle like Final Fantasy VII Crisis Core, or put another number in, like Final Fantasy X-2. And that isn't even close to being the most confusing JRPG naming convention. Over the years, I've absorbed a lot of random bits of knowledge about Final Fantasy, but never really had the framework to understand what I was hearing about. This is basically what I know about the series. So general stuff. I know some of the music, the harp track, the battle fanfare, chocobos, the big chickens, slimes, no, that's Dragon Quest. Final Fantasy I, there are mages, like a red mage, a black mage, maybe a blue mage. Final Fantasy II through VI, not all of these came out in the West originally, so it messed up the numbering. In one of these games, you suplex a train, I think? Final Fantasy VII, the one that people never shut up about. I know more about this one, but we'll come back to it obviously. Final Fantasy The Spirits Within. I saw part of this movie on TV as a kid. I remember thinking it was the most amazing looking, photorealistic CG movie ever, and they were never gonna get any better than that. I was like, 11. Final Fantasy X, the one with the terrible laughing scene.
You probably shouldn't laugh anymore.
There's Blitzball, and also the bad guy is the main character's dad who turned into a monster, I think. Final Fantasy XIII, Lightning is the main character. Troy Baker's in this one? There are creatures called Pulse Fal'Cie or something. I don't know why I know that, my brain is dumb. Final Fantasy XIV, this one's an MMORPG. Nobody liked it at launch, but it's been saved through rigorous updates, and people seem to love it now. Final Fantasy XV, a prince and his boy band entourage drive around in a muscle car. So I played Final Fantasy VII Remake, not really expecting to become a fan of the series, but I wanted to put aside my usual reservations about JRPGs and anime to try and enjoy something a little different from my usual fare, or, barring that, to at least gain an understanding of the appeal of these classic games without actually going back to PlayStation 1 era turn-based combat. It was, in some ways, an anthropological expedition into a series and subculture that I knew wasn't exactly my jam. So did it work? Do I appreciate Final Fantasy now? Well, sort of. I kept wondering throughout my time with the game, did I like it enough and was I invested enough to play the next one? The answer to that question went back and forth, but it did land with a definitive thud on one side by the end. For most of the runtime, it was a mixed bag for me. Some things worked better than I expected, and some of the things that I didn't like still kept my interest. The cardinal sin is to be boring, and Remake takes a while to commit that trespass. Because nothing about this series is straightforward, Final Fantasy VII Remake is just the first in a series of games that will retell the whole of the original classic. This game covers roughly the first 7 or 8 hours of the original 40-ish hour game. Those 7 hours are expanded out into roughly 30 or more hours in this remake. That has dramatic consequences that we'll talk about in a minute. I knew a lot of random assorted details about this game going in. I knew the characters by name, I knew some of the iconic visuals like the giant sword and the glowing city. I knew Sephiroth as the bad guy and Cloud as the hero. And I knew famously that Aerith dies. Spoilers for a decades-old game. But aside from this smattering of unconnected facts, I really didn't know what this game was about, who these characters were, the general shape of the plot, or really anything about the ending. Although I knew I wasn't getting a complete story from the remake, I was counting on it to start filling in those details, maybe even to draw me in, despite my reservations. Remake is one of the most inconsistent big-budget games I've played in a long time. It has a lot of stuff going for it, but also a lot of rough edges. For every fantastically directed sequence, there's another awkward, stilted scene that goes on too long. The stylish combat provides a strong core gameplay hook, but when the game tries to do something different, it usually doesn't play very well or add much to the experience. Sometimes the graphics are cutting edge, main characters look great, but side characters are kind of rough. Some vistas are breathtakingly gorgeous, but then you run into skyboxes and textures that look a generation or two out of date. This is a big game with a whole lot of cutscenes, animation work, characters, and environments. Not everything got an equal amount of attention, and Remake is less good at hiding that than some other games. I didn't know whether I was going to like this cast of characters, and I don't exactly love them, but I enjoyed this element more than I thought I would. It's kind of surreal seeing characters created in the 90s with 90s sensibilities of coolness realized in modern high-fidelity 3D. The designs are still striking, and they do successfully make the leap to modern visuals while keeping the original charm intact. Although maybe the reason I accept them is because they've been part of video game culture for decades. Their behavior, and especially their dialogue, aren't naturalistic, but I don't think they're going for that. At least I hope not. The game seems at least a little bit self-aware of how silly it is. That makes it endearing instead of off-putting. Cloud Strife is not only the main character, he's the linchpin of the ensemble. The rest of the main cast are relentlessly sincere, heart-sleeve-wearing optimists, despite being members of an oppressed underclass living in the slums. If it was just them, I don't think I'd be able to stomach it, much less engage with the story on any level. But Cloud provides the necessary contrast that makes it all work. He's reserved, antisocial, and blunt. Cloud is the cynic looking sideways at all of these unnaturally cheerful eco-terrorists and wondering what in the world is wrong with them. It's not that they're wrong and Cloud's right, they just choose to express their very sincere pro-social beliefs in fairly strange ways and inopportune times. That's hard to take seriously if any of it is meant to be taken seriously at all. There's definitely stuff to like about this game, even for me, an outsider to this whole thing. Certain moments and sequences combine strong character design, good direction, beautiful visuals and music to create something extremely memorable. But as the game went on, these moments became fewer and farther between, and my patience for the less essential elements grew thin. The problem isn't the intent of scenes, it's the direction. It's the editing, or lack thereof. Sometimes it's excellent, like the highly energetic opening sequence that really got me excited about the game in front of me. Other scenes, not so much. They can frustrate, obfuscate, or just drag on. I played a little bit of the original game in the process of making this video, and I was struck by how much quicker the pace was, and how that helped maintain the excitement of the in medias res opening, despite the age of the game. Most of the same beats were there, but the dialogue was much pithier in the original. It gets across the same ideas with a lot fewer words in a lot less time, and that's almost always preferable, especially when you're trying to create an exciting, urgent sequence with a ticking clock. Although I haven't played much of the original, I'm guessing this is the pattern throughout. The new game consistently has more words, more stopping and starting, longer, more drawn-out scenes. That's a significant part of how 7 hours becomes 30 plus. So many of this game's issues stem from the decision to draw it out from shorter source material. This decision was an immediate red flag. Either the story would have to be drastically different to account for this huge increase in length, or else be packed with filler and unnecessary bonus material, like Peter Jackson's Hobbit trilogy. I can understand why the developers wanted to spend a whole game in Midgar. It's a really cool setting, worth spending extra time on. But there's a big difference between fleshing out the story and setting, something that's truly additive, and just being long-winded. Expanding some of the side characters was a fine idea. Biggs, Wedge, and Jesse are barely characters in the original game. Here, they're decently developed secondary cast members, particularly Jessie. I like the chapter where you visit her parents in the upper city. We get some nice, light moments with the characters. We gain a better understanding of Jessie, her background, her life, her ambitions, what she gave up to be an Avalanche. Seeing her dad bedridden due to Shinra's negligence helps humanize the environmental and social conflict. This is some of the better new content not present in the original game, and I think it makes a great case for the expansion of the story. But other additions aren't so great. As cool a setting as Midgar can be, you spend an awful lot of time in the most visually dull parts of it. Sewers, industrial areas, tunnels, highways. The slums are pretty dull looking too, but at least the skybox is really awe-inspiring. It gives a real sense of the city's immense scale. Making the city feel bigger is one justification for the in-between spaces taking up so much of the runtime, but this is ultimately a detriment. Toward the back half of the game, the extended nature of the content is far less useful to world and character building, and far less acceptable in terms of its place in the narrative structure. A good example of this is how the game handles one of its most pivotal events. You discover that Shinra is going to drop the Sector 7 plate, totally annihilating the slums below, except for all the people who inexplicably survive somehow. This is essentially a ticking time bomb. Once you find out, nothing else matters until it's resolved. And yet the game chooses this moment in the story to hit you with two of its most worthless filler chapters. There's a slow, meandering trip through the sewers, followed by a slow, meandering trudge through a haunted train yard. Once you actually get to Sector 7, it still takes another whole chapter for the actual event to occur. It takes forever to ascend the pillar. It takes forever to find Marlene. Even pressing the button to drop the plate is super drawn out and awkward. The game keeps throwing meaningless busy work in your way. It makes the conflict feel staged, the stakes artificial. It kills the pacing, steals the sense of urgency, and destroys my ability to be invested in this crucial moment. Anytime a larger story is divided up into smaller pieces, you have to solve the problem of how to end the individual installments. Preferably, each part should accomplish these three things. They should be narratively coherent, they should satisfy the audience even though they aren't getting the entire story, and they should provide clear story hooks for the next part. In my view, Final Fantasy VII Remake does none of those things particularly well with its ending. It's confusing, unsatisfying, and it trades compelling narrative ideas for less defined, less interesting ones. At the beginning of the game, the story is very clear. We're quickly informed who these characters are, what their mission is, and what actions they're taking to accomplish it. Things remain fairly lucid for most of the game, despite some wild diversions of plot. But toward the end, the goalposts shift dramatically without sufficient explanation. In the last third of the game, when the narrative should be building to some sort of conclusion, it starts throwing a lot of curveballs. We get introduced to the concepts of ancients and aliens and... ancient aliens? There's a mythical promised land somewhere. There's a bizarre explanation of those wispy ghost things that have been showing up throughout the game. We're told, no, Shinra isn't the biggest threat, it's Sephiroth. We're not shown this or given an explanation of why he's such a big threat. All these twists and revelations are fine for the end of Act 1 of a story, as in the original game, but as the ending of Part 1, it's pretty poorly timed. All of it is made worse by the nonsensical way that events play out. First, you find President Shinra hanging off the side of the building for some reason. Then he gets stabbed by Sephiroth. Then Barrett gets killed too, but only temporarily. The Whispers, the ghost things which we're told enforce the will of the planet, bring him back to life. Not the president, though. His death counts. Cloud tries to follow Sephiroth up to the roof, but then he turns into somebody else. Did he do that? Did the Whispers do it? Was that ever Sephiroth at all? Then an entirely new villain is introduced in place of the president. Finally, after a bunch of extra boss fights and an overlong motorcycle sequence, you reach the actual, real ending of the game, where everything continues to make very, very little sense. The group decides to enter some kind of portal or tear in reality, which Aerith insists will change everything. What does that mean? How does she know? What's going on? Those questions apply to a lot of what happens during the last 2 to 3 hours of the game.
Aerith, what are you not telling us?
I'm lost in a maze. Every step is taking me further from the path.
You fight a giant amalgam of whispers, I think. Then you fight Sephiroth. Somehow he separates Cloud from the group and asks him to join his quest to defy fate. I guess he has metatextual powers of perception, and he doesn't want to lose this time. But didn't the party help him already by slaying the Whispers? During the ending sequence, we're also introduced to Zack, another soldier. As the party leaves Midgar, Zack enters the city, with an injured Cloud, just in case the rest of the ending was too straightforward and comprehensible. Both the events in these scenes and the way they're staged, edited, and presented to the player beg so many questions. And they aren't the fun type of questions about where the narrative is going, or how our heroes are going to resolve problems and overcome challenges. They're basic kinds of questions like, what did I just see? What did any of this mean? One of the biggest casualties of dividing up the original story is a proper introduction of Sephiroth. My understanding is that he shows up a bit later in the original game, but the creators of the remake naturally wanted to make sure that the big bad got introduced in this game. Unfortunately, the way it happens is nonsensical to those unfamiliar with the story. I know Sephiroth is the villain. I've known that for decades because of how popular the original game is. But that's all I know about him. I don't know why he's bad. I don't know his motivation or history. And after playing this game, I still don't know those things. They're hinted at. Characters tell you he's bad, they tell you that he's a threat, but not why. There's no shortage of dialogue and cutscenes in this game, but nobody will do me the courtesy of a basic explanation. I want to be clear, I don't necessarily have issues with any particular narrative choice. The problem is the concentration of confusing, unresolved, unexplained events right at the end. It's way too much. I feel like I've gone from playing a proactive role in the narrative to just moving through a series of events that I don't understand, and the game won't bother explaining to me. Presumably this will all make sense in time, and I'm sure a lot of it is understandable to players familiar with the original story. It wasn't apparent from the start, but by the end of the game, it's clear that it assumes players already know the story of the original game. If this were a sequel, that would be totally fair. But it's called a remake. While remakes can mess with an audience's expectations by reinterpreting or twisting parts of the original, they should be narratively coherent to a new audience, even if it is a richer experience for returning players. At the end, Final Fantasy VII Remake loses that narrative coherence. The effect of this is to tell newcomers, don't bother. This isn't for you. It's not a remake, it's a remix. If you aren't already familiar with Final Fantasy VII, kindly see yourself out. All that stuff with the Whispers and Destiny and Fate was just the developers giving themselves a license to change the story and play with metatextual knowledge. This means we're not really getting a retelling of the original story. We're going to get something that could be wildly different. That's not what I signed up for. And if the creators were okay with making major changes, I wish they had shuffled some things around in the story to make the ending of this game work better. Obviously, I've got some problems with how Remake turned out. I got the game from my PlayStation Plus subscription, so I didn't feel any obligation to the sunk cost fallacy to finish it. I rolled credits because I did enjoy a lot of things about the game. I actually respect the creative risks they're taking with 7 Remake. It would have been easier to make a devoted, exacting reconstruction of the old game with a shiny new coat of paint and some voice acting. The route they've chosen is a lot more labor-intensive, much more creatively risky. It may or may not pay off, but it is more exciting than the safe, sanitized efforts that we often see with remakes, reboots, and revitalizations. It would have been easy for me to make a video mocking the dumb moments in this game. There are plenty of those. I could have gotten hung up on the minute idiosyncrasies and written it off completely, but I tried my best to give it a fair shake, meet it on its own terms. I tried to assess it in good faith, looking at the bigger picture. I can't really evaluate this game in totality, though. No one will be able to do that until the remake series is complete, but I can say with conviction, this is not a good introduction to the Final Fantasy series. You know what's funny? In the process of making this video, I started up Final Fantasy XV and saw this. Oh, this is the one they wanted me to play. So is my first Final Fantasy game my final Final Fantasy game? Not necessarily. The anthology nature of the series means that many of my problems with this game don't apply to the series as a whole. But there are an awful lot of games out there I haven't tried, even amongst other long-running JRPGs. I've never played a Dragon Quest, or a Persona, or a Yakuza game. If I did play another Final Fantasy, it might be the original version of 7, or maybe 15 since they pitched that as a good starting point. But as for future installments of Final Fantasy VII Remake, I don't think so. I'll be curious to hear how it turns out, curious about the fan consensus and how much of the story has changed, but I don't think I'll experience it firsthand. This project did give me a better understanding of Final Fantasy, what makes it special and appealing to players. These games can be incredibly creative, visually lush, full of imagination. They aren't afraid to try new, sometimes wildly different things. And somehow, Square Enix has built a popular and successful franchise of expensive, big-budget games that are consistently taking risks. In an industry where risk aversion is too common, that's admirable, even if I never end up playing another one.